2061 Odyssey 3, Chapter 10, Ship of Fools. For the first 48 hours of the voyage, Haywood Floyd could not really believe the comfort, the spaciousness, the sheer extravagance of Universe's living arrangements. Yet most of his fellow passengers took them for granted. Those who had never left Earth before assumed that all spaceships must be like this. He had to look back at the history of aeronautics to put matters in the right perspective. In his own lifetime, he had witnessed, indeed experienced, the revolution that had occurred in the skies of the planet now dwindling behind him. Between the clumsy old Leonov and the sophisticated universe lay exactly 50 years. Emotionally, he couldn't really believe that, but it was useless arguing with arithmetic. In just 50 years had separated the Wright brothers from the first jet airliners. At the beginning of that half century, intrepid aviators had hopped from field to field, begoggled and windswept on open chairs. At its end, grandmothers had slumbered peacefully between continents at 1,000 kilometers an hour. So he should not, perhaps, have been astonished at the luxury and elegant decor of his stateroom, or even the fact that he had a steward to keep it tidy. The generously sized window was the most startling feature of his suite, and at first he felt quite uncomfortable thinking of the tons of air pressure it was holding in check against the implacable and never for a moment relaxing vacuum of space. The biggest surprise, even though the advanced literature should have prepared him for it, was the presence of gravity. Universe was the first spaceship ever built to cruise under continuous acceleration, except for the few hours of the mid course turnaround when her huge propellant tanks were fully loaded with the 5,000 tons of water. She could manage a tenth of a G. Not much, but enough to keep loose objects from lifting around. This was particularly convenient at meal times, though it took a few days for the passengers to learn not to stir their soup too vigorously. 48 hours out from Earth, the population of Universe had already stratified itself into four distinct classes. The aristocracy consisted of Captain Smith and his officers. Next came the passengers, then crew, non commissioned, and stewards, and then steerage. That was the description that the five young space scientists had adopted for themselves, first as a joke, but later with a certain amount of bitterness. When Floyd compared their cramped and jury rigged quarters with his own luxurious cabin, he could see their point of view, and soon became the conduit of their complaints to the captain. Yet, all things considered, they had little to grumble about. In the rush to get the ship ready, it had been touch and go as to whether there would be any accommodation for them and their equipment. Now they could look forward to deploying instruments around and on the comet. During the critical days before it rounded the sun and departed once more to the outer reaches of the solar system, the members of the science team would establish their reputations on this voyage and knew it. Only in moments of exhaustion or fury with misbehaving instrumentation did they start complaining about the noisy ventilating system, the claustrophobic cabins, and occasional strange smells of unknown origin. But never the food, which everyone agreed was excellent. Much better, Captain Smith assured them, than Darwin had on the Beagle, to which Victor Willis had promptly retorted, "How does he know? And by the way, Beagle's commander cut his throat when he got back to England. That was rather typical of Victor, perhaps the planet's best known science communicator to his fans, or pop scientists to his equally numerous detractors. I it would be unfair to call them enemies. Admiration for his talents was universal, if occasionally grudging. So once again, that was rather typical of Victor, perhaps the planet's best known science communicator to his fans, or pop scientist to his equally numerous detractors. It would be unfair to call them enemies. Admiration for his talents was universal, if occasionally grudging. His soft, mid Pacific accents and expansive gestures on camera were widely parodied, and he had been credited or blamed for the revival of full length beards. A man who grows that much hair, critics were fond of saying, must have a lot to hide. He was certainly the most instantly recognizable of the six VIPs. Though Floyd, who no longer regarded himself as a celebrity, always referred to them ironically as the famous five. Ava Merlin could often walk unrecognized on Park Avenue on the rare occasions when she emerged from her apartment. Dmitry Mihailovich, to his considerable annoyance, was a good 10 centimeters below average height. This might help to explain his fondness of thousand-piece orchestras, real or synthesized, but did not enhance his public image. Clifford Greenberg and Margaret Mbala also fell into the category of famous unknowns, though this would certainly change when they got back to Earth. The first man to land on Mercury had one of those pleasant, unremarkable faces that are very hard to remember. Moreover, the days when he had dominated the news were now 30 years in the past. And like most authors who are not addicted to talk shows and autographing sessions, Miss Mbala would be unrecognized by the vast majority of her millions of readers. Her literary fame had been one of the sensations of the 40s. A scholarly study of the Greek pantheon was not unusually a candidate for the bestseller list, but Miss Umbala had placed its eternally inexhaustible myths in the contemporary space age setting. Names that a century earlier had been familiar only to astronomers and classical scholars were now part of every educated person's world picture. Almost every day there would be news from Ganymede, Callisto, Io, Titan, Iapetus, or even more obscure worlds like Carme, Pasiphae, Hyperion, Phoebe. Her book would have been no more than modestly successful, however, had she not focused on the complicated family life of Jupiter Zeus, father of all the gods, as well as much else. And by a stroke of luck, an editor of genius had changed her original title, The View from Olympus, to The Passions of the Gods. Envious academics usually refer to it as Olympic lusts, but invariably wished they had written it. Not surprisingly, it was Maggie M., as she was quickly christened by her fellow passengers, who first used the phrase ship of fools. Victor Willis adopted it eagerly and soon discovered an intriguing historical resonance. Almost a century ago, Catherine Ann Porter had herself sailed with a group of scientists and writers aboard an ocean liner to watch the launch of Apollo 17 and the end of the first phase of lunar exploration. I'll think about it, Miss Mbala had remarked ominously when this was reported to her. Perhaps it's time for a third version. But I won't know, of course, until we get back to Earth.